1 Samuel chapter 24, we're going to go through this passage here. We looked at last time about Jonathan, and Jonathan encouraging David in his life at a moment when David was in the wilderness of Ziph, and David was struggling, and really at a point where he's crying out for God to help him. And of course, David, he ultimately, we see, he will turn to God and seek for him, and seek for the Lord to work in his life. But it's wonderful to know that God uses people, individuals also, his children, to be able to encourage one another. And Jonathan ended up leaving the kingdom, the comforts of the kingdom, and going into the wilderness and finding David. And in strengthening, the Bible teaches that he strengthened his hand in God. He strengthened David's hand in God. And so he encouraged David. But let's notice in 1 Samuel 24, in verse 1, now it happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines, that it was told him, saying, take note, listen, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. So he came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave. So here it's believed that this psalm that we're going to look at is at this time when David actually is going to write this psalm. So let's go into Psalms 57. Psalms 54 is what we looked at last week. But let's notice here in Psalms 57. Psalms 57. And we'll see what David writes beginning this psalm, Psalms 57. Let's notice here, Psalms beginning verse 1. Psalms 57. To the chief musician, set to. Now again, in the King James, the wording here, you may not fully understand the Hebrew wording here, but the tune that it's set to is a tune of do not destroy. That's the tune of this. And so then we have a Mishtam of David when he fled from Saul into the cave. Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for my soul trusts in you. And in the shadow of your wings will I make my refuge until the storm passes by, until these calamities have passed by. The words oftentimes it's used, though, is described as storms. That David says, I'm now in the midst of these storms that are raging, and that, Lord, I'm going to be under the shadow of your wings. I'm going to trust in you. And again, here we see Saul has basically surrounded David in a way. They were hiding in this area and in the caves, and Saul hears of where he is, but Saul doesn't fully know exactly. In fact, he doesn't know exactly where David is. He knows he's in this region, in this area, but it's very interesting because Saul actually does find where David is, but he doesn't realize it. He doesn't recognize it. But David is crying out to God, and he's saying, God, I'm going to hide in, because look, it doesn't matter. David could try to seek refuge in the caves, but even that only goes so far. His refuge is going to be found in God Almighty. When I read that there, and the depiction of the calamities, the storms passing by, I go back and I remember years ago when we were living at my grandmother's house, and there was a particular day where there was bad storms that were coming through Kinston, North Carolina. But I remember that my brother was sitting on the porch. I was probably about maybe 12 years old. He's sitting on the porch. He may have been about 13, but then after a little bit, he's watching he's listening to the thunder. He's watching the heavy rains. He's seeing the lightning go down, and he liked seeing that stuff. I didn't really care about that. I kind of wanted to stay away from the storms. But he was out there on the porch looking and seeing. All of a sudden, he comes running in the house, and he said, there's a tornado! There's a tornado outside. And I thought, quit messing around, quit joking. And he said, no, there's a tornado. And sure enough, my mother ran to the door. She yells at us, tells us to get under the table, which I don't know what the table's going to do, That's where they tell you in the schools many years ago about, if there's a nuclear, bomb or something, get under the tables, under the desks, like that's going to do anything. So, and my mother ran to the door, and what had happened was, and again, it was all just kind of in an instant, but the tornado was actually forming over my grandmother's house. It's actually forming right above her home. And we didn't realize that. And my mother's at the door, and she's holding the door. Now, again, I'm thinking to myself, I get it. I know. You're holding it, making sure the door doesn't bust open. But, really, do you really think the tornado's just going to knock, and then, no, nobody's home. But she's at the door, and she's just hanging on to pushing the door, And again, in that instance, that's what she's just wanting us to do. There were better places to be than under the table, by the way. But again, that moment, you're just trying to get somewhere. And what happened was, in fact, my Aunt Carol was in her car about to leave my grandmother's house, and it formed, and she was in the car, it formed right over the house, but it actually landed in the front yard. And so then it ended up going and turning down the road. It bypassed all of these different homes and went down a dirt path and went and hit and destroyed my uncle and aunt's home. So, and it was so weird the direction that it took. Now, it was very interesting, what happened there, because I look back and I remember we were praying for my aunt and my uncle at the time. Now, my aunt and my uncle's families, they were feuding with each other. Our cousins were fighting and feuding. In fact, the day prior, the police had to come out there. And so my mother said, pray for them, pray that something happened to get their attention. Well, my goodness. That got their attention. My cousins were actually in the house. They were in the homes. Now, nobody died. The worst extent was that one of my cousins broke his collarbone. But that was about it, But these were trailers, completely demolished, like a deck of cards. That you would see the homes, but they didn't die. And I remember, they were, my cousins were actually walking down the road when that took place, and they were weeping and crying and hugging each other. And I thought, man, prayers work. But I also thought, maybe pray, make sure you pray in a specific way. But anyway, so again, but I look at this, I read about this, and I think about it, that moment. The fear that we had in trying to just find somewhere safe, somewhere secure. David knows that his life is in God's hands. He knows that in this, when he's declaring this, Lord, I'm going to hide under you. Well, you are that refuge. Lord, when all else fails, you will never fail. And so here we notice in 1 Samuel 24, in verse 3, it says that he came to the sheepfolds by the road where was the cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. And David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. And then the men of David said to him, this is the day which the Lord said to you, behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you. And David arose. Now again, so they're hidden there in the cave. And they see that Saul comes in. What does Saul do? Well, Saul actually goes in the cave to use the restroom. So it's very interesting here. But he goes in the cave, and that's the terminology when it deals with this covering of the feet. In fact, when you read about Elijah, he's laughing at the prophets of Baal. He really makes this kind of joke about, well, where is Baal? He's not answering you. He says, is he on vacation or is he on the pot? He's basically, is he using the bathroom, and he can't answer you. And so here, Saul doesn't give a thought about really David being, he's right there. But he goes in the cave and he goes and does his business. Well, we notice here that David's men that were with him, they said, look, now's your chance. Kill Saul. It happened afterward that David's heart, David, actually, he cut off a piece of Saul's robe. And then in David's heart, though, it troubled him. Why? Because he cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed. He believes in this, that Saul he was anointed king of Israel, and he cannot himself take out vengeance upon Saul. He says here, and here I had stretched out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David restrained his servants with these words, and did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and he went on his way. Now that, again, so interesting here that David, in the midst of him running and fleeing, crying out for God. God did deliver Saul in his hands in this way, but David also, with his integrity, believes, I cannot who am I to actually kill the anointed one that God had chosen to be king of Israel? So it's very interesting. So we go back here in Psalms 57 and we go on further. Notice it says here, he's crying out in Psalms 57 in verse 1 again, be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for my soul trusts in you. In the shadow of your wings I will make my refuge until the storm passes by, until these calamities have passed over. I will cry out to God Most High, to God who performs all things for me. Now that's very interesting here. Now there's different translations that kind of convey what this really means here when David cries out in this, and he says, I will call unto God. In one, and a lot of times I like to go through the Young's literal, because it's hard, sometimes a harder read, but that's going to give you more of an understanding of what the Hebrew is actually conveying in a way. And what it says, I call to God Most High, to God who is perfecting for me. Who is perfecting for me. And then in another, he says in the English Standard, I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. To God who fulfills his purpose for me. And then this one here, and I think this one gives it a little too simpler. In God's Word translation, it says, I call to God Most High, to the God who does everything for me. That's not exactly the conveyance here. But what David is saying when he says God performs all things, he is saying even at that moment, God is taking the trials and the suffering and the hardship, and God is working in the midst of that. We have a similar verse that we use at times when we go through hardship that a lot of people think about. Romans 8:28. For we know that all things work together for good to those who are the called. Now the problem is that a lot of people want to take the first part and they want to say, well, everything's working for good. But again, to who? To those who are the called according to his purpose. To those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. And so people want to claim that and just, they're going to take these promises and verses. Well, you got to go even further. And then the question is, what is that good that it's talking about? Because people look and say, well, God's going to make everything great for me, for my life. And everything's going to work out in the end for myself. That's not what it's really saying here. What is the good? The good is in Romans 8:29. 8:29 says, for whom he did foreknow, he did predestinate to be conformed in the image of his Son. So that good that God is working in our lives, again, working to fulfill his purpose. What is his purpose? What is that good? It is that we can be molded in the image of Christ. For David, he has a call on his life that God said, you are going to reign as king. I've chosen you. And David knows God's given that promise. Now it's hard to see because the moment David's anointed king, it seems like everything's going well. And then he ends up, through God's power, defeating Goliath. And he's getting into the kingdom well. But then, boy, who could have known that Saul is going to just come after his life the whole time? He's going to go nuts. He's going to be jealous and with rage. He's going to continue to seek after David. And now David is just hiding himself. He went from being a shepherd boy to being a mighty warrior, a hero of the Israelites, to being in the kingdom, in the king's castle, king's palace, to now being in caves and actually in enemy territory at times. And so here, David is crying out, and we see at times he's saying, God, help me, God. He doesn't fully understand, but we see the promise here in verse 2. Boy, how wonderful. He says, I know God is working it out in the end. He's working presently in these things. I may not fully understand it, but God is performing. He's perfecting these things for me. And so notice as we go on in verse 3, he shall send from heaven and save me. He's using this terminology here in the sense of where God sent manna from heaven, came down to feed the children of Israel, but also he's using this in a way of the angels that are coming, and this great host of angels that many would not see, but Elisha saw the host of angels, And David's saying God is going to send his power. He's going to send his provisions. He will send from heaven and save me. He reproaches the one who would swallow me up, Selah. God shall, notice this, send forth his mercy and his truth. Now I think again that is so wonderful, because if you go to John chapter 1 and you read in verse 14 and verse 17, it says that in Christ there is grace and truth. There is grace that is given and truth. And then in 17 it says that the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth was given through Jesus Christ. It came by him. And so here I think about when I'm reading this, did God really send his mercy and his truth, his grace? He did. He sent it through Jesus Christ. So David is crying out, and he's saying, I know God is going to perform what he promised. He's working presently. It may not look good. It may seem hopeless, but I know God is working in the midst. And he says God's going to send from heaven, even if all else fails on this earth, and I have no other help. God's going to send from heaven, and I'm going to have heavenly help. And he says, and he's going to send forth his mercy and his truth. Notice in verse 4, he says, my soul is among lions. I lie among the sons of men who are set on fire. Is he saying that there are people that are actually literally on fire and they're running around screaming and saying, help me, I'm on fire? He's not saying that. He's saying, though, there are ones that are so burned with rage and anger, and they are just completely set on seeking for the life of David. Some think that David, when he's writing this, he's declaring that he's around certain ones, even of his own group, that he may not fully trust, that are there. It's not like they were wonderful, tremendous individuals that were with David. But some look at that David's just simply saying that everywhere he goes, his soul is among lions, because he may be in a place where there are enemies around him, or Saul is coming after his life. But he says they're set on fire. Notice he goes on to say here, their teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue is a sharp sword. They continually seek after my life. They speak ill of me. They go against me. The things that they say about me, all of this. He says, he gives this depiction of a vicious beast that is seeking to attack his life. So here it just seems like what he's describing. Now I think it's very interesting because he doesn't stop here. He doesn't say, boy, they're so vicious, they're so tough, what do I do? I just want to give up. Notice what he says in verse 5. And David reveals to us the way of victory, the way that we can in ourselves. What do? We encourage ourselves in the Lord. He says here, be exalted, O God, above the heavens, and let your glory be above all the earth. So right in the middle there of this psalm, David is saying they're coming after my life, they're seeking. I know God is working. And I know that in the end he can send his mercy and his truth. And I know that even though there's so many that are coming after my life, there's so many that are just so vicious, so vile. And then he just shifts gears. And he says, God, you be exalted. Is it just simply David has, he's just kind of jumped into a whole nother subject? I think David is showing to us when all else seems to be crumbling, and when it seems like that you are just in a hopeless condition. What did Paul and Silas do when they were in prison? They sang. And they looked at God. And they said, I think that they probably sang some songs. I think they encouraged themselves in the Lord. And so the flesh doesn't want to do this. In the hard times when we want to question and we want to say, God, why? And we want to, well, God, please take this away. And then at times, look, it really just comes a point where you just need to simply rejoice and say, God, you be glorified. Come what may, God, it's about you and you be glorified. He said, be exalted, O God, above the heavens, and let your glory be above all the earth. That is the point of life itself, to glorify God, to exalt God. He says as we go on in verse 6, they have prepared a net for my steps. My soul is bowed down. They have dug a pit before me. Into the midst of it, they themselves have fallen. Now that again, he says they've dug the pit, but they themselves, they have fallen in the very thing. So I think it's very interesting because again, when we go back into 1 Samuel 24, here Saul he goes in this cave, the most ignoble way here that David could have killed him while he's using the restroom. He could have done that, but David doesn't do that, okay? And then what happens is in 1 Samuel 24, in verse 8, when Saul has no thought of anything of what David just did, where he cut a piece of his robe and could have killed him. Saul goes out of the cave, and then David, it says in verse 8, David also arose afterward, and he went out of the cave, and he called out to Saul, saying, My Lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed down. And David said to Saul, Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Indeed, David seeks your harm? This is where David says their teeth are sharpened, they're vicious, they're the things that they say, because there are ones that, oh yes, David, they want to get in good with Saul. And they can see that they can, I knew David was a liar and a cheat the first time I met him. And he just tried to go after Goliath just to steal your accolades. But notice, and he goes on, he says, Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you today into my hand in the cave. Again, the trap that they tried to set, it's been placed upon themselves. He says, And someone urged me to kill you, but my eye spared you. And I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord or the king, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see. And he pulls out the piece of the robe in his hand. He says, I cut off the corner of your robe, but I did not kill you. Know and see that there is no evil or rebellion in my hand. If I wanted to kill you, I could have done it, but I didn't. I have not sinned against you, yet you hunt my life to take it. Let the Lord judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you. But my hand shall not be against you. He said, I'm not going to fight against you. You come after my life, God's going to judge you for it. As the proverb of the ancients says, wickedness proceeds from the wicked, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom do you pursue? A dead dog, a flea? And David is really in this point, he says, who am I really even? Who are you really trying to come after? He says, I'm nobody. And here in verse 15, therefore let the Lord be judge, a judge between you and me, and see and plead my case and deliver me out of your hand. So it was, when David finished speaking these words to Saul, that Saul said, Is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And boy, it's almost at this moment, jealousy and bitterness can destroy your life. It destroys the lives around you, but it can massively cloud your vision, cloud your mind, and you're so focused and so consumed. And it can take over and here it's like he has this moment of clarity. And he says, Is that you, David? And he weeps. And David said, You are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded. Saul says to David, You are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me with good, whereas I've rewarded you with evil. And you have shown this day how you have dealt well with me, for when the Lord delivered me into your hand, you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him get away safely? Therefore may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now I know indeed that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Well, you know what? If he could have just had that kind of mentality at the beginning, wouldn't that be nice? But he doesn't. And again, Saul still is later on going to be bitter. But he says here, Now, swear now to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, that you will not destroy my name from my father's house. And David swore to Saul, and Saul went home. But David and his men went up to the stronghold. So let's finish out in Psalms 57. Psalms 57. Notice again when David says, they dug a pit before me, but the reality is that they have fallen in it themselves. And now we come here, we end out in verses 7 on to 11. My heart is steadfast. My heart is fixed is the word that is used. This word actually means, that's given, my heart is fixed, is steadfast. It actually means my heart is prepared. Prepared. In the sense that David is preparing his heart. He's prepared to give praise and singing to God. He says, my heart is fixed in God. It's prepared to rejoice in Him. I will sing, I will give praise. Awake, my glory. Awake, lute and harp. I will awake in the dawn. I will rise early. I will sing unto the Lord. I'm going to rejoice throughout the day. I will praise you, O Lord. I think, again, this we see here in the end, where David, once Saul goes back and David says, God, thank you. I was surrounded. I felt like I could go nowhere. But Lord, you have worked it out. You have worked all these things. And Lord, I see this here, and I'm just going to rejoice. I'm going to wake up in the morning. I'm going to praise you, God. I will praise you among the people. I will sing to you among the nations. For your mercy reaches unto the heavens, and your truth unto the clouds. And then again, what does he say here? Just like he said in verse 5, be exalted, O God, above the heavens, and let your glory be above all the earth. He is rejoicing and saying, God, it is all about you. It's about your glory and you to be exalted in life. And so again, we see here kind of the backdrop in this, and where David he's just rejoicing, placing his hope in God, and he's rejoicing that here, it seems, for a time, Saul is not coming after his life again, and God has delivered him in this. But again, the reminder for us in our own hearts and lives, when unexpected trials come our way, do we prepare our hearts? Do we fix our hearts on God? Do we prepare our hearts and our minds to focus on the goodness and love of God? And then also, do we lift up and exalt His name in the midst of those trials and those circumstances? Do we say to God, be exalted, and let your glory be above all the earth? Hopefully we do that in our lives. Not an easy thing at times, but again, to be reminded, God, ultimately it's His glory, and He is to be exalted. But let's pray this evening. Lord, I thank you. I pray you speak to each heart and help us, Lord, again as we go forth, and help us to be witnesses unto you and just shine forth in this community, and again to sing your praises and to sing that song, Lord, be exalted above the heavens, and let your glory be above all the earth. We just thank you, we praise you this evening in Jesus Christ. Amen. God bless you.